The evening began unremarkably, the kind of quiet that settled easily in small towns where nothing much ever happened. A black SUV rolled into the parking lot of a modest diner, its sleek exterior gleaming faintly under the dim glow of overhead lights. The driver, dressed simply in a gray hoodie and jeans, stepped out and glanced around before heading inside. To anyone watching, the scene was ordinary, just another stranger stopping for a meal. Inside the diner, the smells of sizzling grease and fresh coffee hung in the air, wrapping around patrons like a familiar blanket. The bell above the door jingled softly as the man entered. He moved without hurry, his presence drawing little notice from the few diners scattered at booths and tables. With a quick glance around the room, he chose a seat by the window, a booth that afforded a clear view of the parking lot. Mike Tyson wasn't here to be recognized. There was no entourage, no cameras, no fanfare. He had come seeking anonymity, and in this small-town diner, he had found it. For now, anyway. The waitress approached, a notepad in one hand and a pencil tucked behind her ear. Her smile was easy but practiced, the kind of expression that came from years of repetition. "What'll it be?" she asked, her tone warm but brisk. "Burger, fries, water," Tyson said, his voice calm, measured. The waitress nodded, jotting down the order and offering a quick, polite smile before heading back to the kitchen. Tyson turned his attention to the window, his eyes drifting to the parking lot. The sun was setting, streaking the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, its glow reflecting off the windshields of parked cars. For a while, he let himself get lost in the sight, a brief reprieve from the relentless pace of the world outside. But his peace was short-lived. In the corner of his eye, he noticed a cluster of uniformed police officers gathered near their patrol cars. There were 5 of them, their postures relaxed but their voices loud enough to carry faintly through the glass. They laughed often, their gestures animated, as if performing for an unseen audience. One officer stood out from the group, his broad frame and commanding presence unmistakable. Sergeant Griff. Even without hearing his words, it was clear he was the leader. His badge glinted under the fading sunlight as he leaned casually against the hood of his cruiser, a smug grin tugging at his lips. Griff was the kind of man who wore his authority like a crown, relishing the way it set him apart. It didn't take long for Griff's gaze to settle on the black SUV. His expression shifted slightly, curiosity giving way to something colder. "Look at that guy," he muttered, loud enough for his companions to hear. His words drew their attention, and soon, all eyes were on the sleek vehicle parked just a few yards away. Griff's grin widened as he spoke again, the exact words lost to distance, but the tone unmistakable. It carried a note of mockery, an edge that didn't quite fit the relaxed atmosphere of the evening. The other officers chuckled in response, their laughter sharp and pointed. One of them, a wiry man with slicked-back hair known as Snake, slapped the hood of a cruiser for emphasis, his amusement loud and unrestrained. Inside the diner, Tyson watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. He had noticed Griff's gaze, the way it lingered too long on the SUV, and he could sense the shift in energy. The laughter outside wasn't just jovial. It was performative, a display meant to signal something more. Tyson took a slow sip of water, his gaze never leaving the group of officers. He was no stranger to attention, whether welcome or not, and the dynamic playing out in the lot was one he recognized all too well. Their postures were relaxed, but their focus on the SUV was anything but casual. There was a deliberateness to it, a shared intent that set his instincts on edge. The waitress returned, setting the glass of water and a small plate of fries in front of him. "Your burger will be right up," she said with a smile, but her voice trailed off when she noticed the direction of his gaze. She glanced toward the parking lot, her own expression tightening as she took in the group of officers. "They've been out there for a while," she said quietly, almost to herself. Tyson didn't respond, his focus still on Griff and his men. Outside, the laughter continued, punctuated by gestures that grew bolder with each passing moment. Griff twirled his baton idly, his body language exuding confidence as he leaned in to say something to Snake. Whatever it was, It drew another round of laughter from the group, their voices cutting through the quiet of the lot. Tyson leaned back in his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't flinch under their attention, didn't turn away from the scene unfolding beyond the glass. Years of experience had taught him the value of stillness, of measured observation. He let the tension settle around him like a second skin, watching and waiting. The sun dipped lower, casting the parking lot in shadow. Inside, the diner hummed with quiet activity. Clinking dishes, soft murmurs of conversation. But for Tyson, the world outside the window was all that mattered. Something was shifting, an undercurrent of unease rippling through the evening. Griff's gaze lingered on the diner, his grin widening as he gestured toward the building. Whatever he said next was met with more laughter, the sound echoing across the empty spaces of the lot. Tyson watched as Snake slapped his baton against his palm, his expression one of exaggerated amusement. The waitress hesitated by the counter, her eyes flicking back to Tyson's booth. She seemed to sense the tension as well, her movements slower now, more cautious. But no one else in the diner appeared to notice, their attention fixed on their meals and conversations. Tyson remained still, his face a mask of calm. He had come here seeking peace, a quiet escape from the noise of the world. But as the laughter outside grew louder, more pointed, it became clear that peace wouldn't be on the menu tonight. The tension in the air thickened, hanging heavy over the small diner like an invisible storm cloud. The officers outside had grown louder, their laughter cutting through the stillness and drawing more than one curious glance from the other diners. For Tyson, the noise was more than a distraction. It was an announcement. It wasn't long before one of them broke away from the pack. The man who entered the diner carried himself with an air of exaggerated confidence, each step deliberate and calculated. He was thin, wiry, and moved like he wanted everyone to notice him. His slicked-back hair shone under the dim light, and his uniform looked just a little too crisp, as if freshly pressed for a performance. They called him Snake, and from the first glance it wasn't hard to see why. Snake sauntered toward Tyson's booth, his boots squeaking faintly against the scuffed tile floor. The conversation in the diner quieted, a few curious eyes following him as he crossed the room. He stopped just short of Tyson's table, leaning casually against the edge of the booth. His grin was thin, sharp, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Nice car," Snake said, his voice carrying just loud enough for those nearby to hear. The words were laced with mockery, but it was the tone that gave them weight. "Too nice for a guy like you. Are you sure you're not lost?" Tyson looked up slowly, his expression calm and unreadable. His dark eyes met Snake's, holding his gaze for a beat longer than most would dare. He didn't flinch, didn't react, just stared with a quiet intensity that made Snake's grin falter for a fraction of a second. "Just getting something to eat," Tyson said simply, his voice low and steady, devoid of any challenge or fear. But Snake wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, the faint scent of stale coffee and cheap aftershave clinging to him like an aura. His grin returned, wider this time, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You know," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "parking violations around here can get pretty expensive. Maybe you should move that thing before it gets towed." For a moment, Tyson said nothing. His gaze flicked briefly to the window, where the other officers were still gathered around his SUV, their laughter faint but persistent. When he looked back at Snake, his expression hadn't changed, calm, measured, and utterly unimpressed. Before Tyson could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Hey, leave him alone," the waitress snapped, her tone sharp enough to draw every eye in the diner. She stood a few feet away, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her expression was fierce, her eyes flashing with indignation as she glared at Snake. The officer turned to her, his grin vanishing in an instant. His face twisted into a scowl as he straightened up, his posture bristling with irritation. "Mind your own business," he muttered, his voice low but venomous. The waitress didn't back down. She crossed her arms, her stance firm despite the tension crackling in the air. "He's just here to eat," she said, her tone unwavering. "So how about you go back outside and leave him alone?" Snake stared at her for a moment, his jaw tightening as if weighing his options. He glanced around the diner, his gaze briefly meeting the eyes of a few curious patrons before settling back on the waitress. Finally, with a huff, he turned on his heel and stalked toward the door, his boots pounding against the floor. The bell above the door jingled faintly as it swung shut behind him. For a moment, the diner was silent, the weight of the exchange lingering in the air. Then, slowly, the hum of conversation returned, though quieter than before. The waitress exhaled sharply, the tension in her shoulders easing as she turned to Tyson. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, laced with concern. Tyson nodded, offering her a small, appreciative smile. "Yeah," he said simply. "Thanks." She gave him a quick nod in return, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade completely. "If he gives you any more trouble, let me know," she said before walking back toward the counter, her head held high. Tyson watched her go, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before shifting back to the window. Outside, the officers had regrouped, their laughter growing louder as Snake rejoined them. Snake gestured animatedly, his posture rigid with frustration as he recounted the encounter. Griff listened intently, his smug grin growing wider with each word. He slapped Snake on the shoulder, muttering something that made the others laugh even harder. From his booth, Tyson's eyes narrowed slightly. He couldn't hear their words, but he didn't need to. Their body language said it all. Mocking, posturing, and emboldened by their numbers. The waitress returned with his burger and fries, setting the plate in front of him with a small smile. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, her tone still kind but slightly tense. "Will do," Tyson replied, giving her another nod of thanks. As she walked away, he picked up the burger and took a bite, chewing slowly as he watched the officers through the window. The food was good, the kind of hearty, unpretentious fare that diners like this were known for. But the taste barely registered. Outside the diner, the atmosphere had shifted. The once quiet parking lot was now an arena of noise and mockery, the laughter of Griff and his crew cutting through the night. They circled the black SUV like predators sizing up prey, their voices loud and pointed, each comment a challenge aimed at no one and everyone. "Look at this thing," Griff said, giving the front tire a light kick with his boot. He chuckled, a sharp, grating sound that echoed through the empty lot. "Bet he thinks he's hot stuff, rolling into our city like he owns the place." Snake leaned against the hood, his wiry frame slouching as he tapped on the windshield with his knuckles. "Probably stolen," he said with a smirk, his voice dripping with mockery. "Guys like him don't drive cars like this unless they're up to no good." The others laughed, emboldened by each other's bravado. Griff twirled his baton in one hand, the motion casual but deliberate. "Nobody disrespects us in our city," he said, his voice loud enough to carry toward the diner. He glanced at Snake and raised an eyebrow. "What do you think? Should we teach him a lesson?" Snake grinned, stepping back from the SUV and sliding his baton free from its loop. "Yeah, let's see how fancy he really is." The laughter grew louder, the group now fully engaged in their performance. It wasn't just about the SUV or its driver anymore. It was about control, dominance, and the unspoken rules they believed they enforced. Inside the diner, Tyson finished the last bite of his burger and pushed the plate aside. The waitress had stopped hovering, though her gaze flicked toward him every now and then, a mix of concern and unease in her eyes. She'd seen the way Snake had walked out, the tension in his movements, the smug look Griff had given her through the window. She didn't say anything, but the way her shoulders were set told Tyson she knew trouble was brewing. Tyson reached for his water, taking a long sip before standing. He adjusted his hoodie, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. The bell chimed faintly as he stepped outside, the cool night air meeting him like a wall. The laughter stopped. Griff and his men turned toward him as one, their grins sharpening, their postures shifting subtly into something more rigid, more confrontational. They formed a loose semicircle, their bodies blocking the path to his SUV. Griff stood at the center, his baton resting casually on his shoulder, his expression a mix of amusement and challenge. Well, Griff drawled, stepping forward. There he is. The man of the hour. Tyson didn't respond immediately. His eyes swept the group, taking in their stances, their weapons, the way their hands hovered near their belts. He had seen this before, this dance of power, this game they played to make themselves feel bigger. I'm just trying to leave, Tyson said, his voice calm but firm. Griff's grin widened. Oh, we'll get to that. But first, we need to have a little chat. He gestured with his baton toward the SUV. That's quite the ride you've got there. Mind telling me where you got it? Tyson met his gaze evenly. It's mine. Is that so? Griff said, his tone full of mock surprise. He turned to the others, who chuckled on cue. Funny, because it sure doesn't look like it belongs to someone like you. The air grew heavier, the tension palpable. Tyson's posture didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Look, I haven't done anything wrong. Just let me go. Griff's grin vanished, replaced by a sneer. We'll decide if you've done something wrong, he said, stepping closer. In fact, you match the description of someone we're looking for. Big guy, dark hoodie, suspicious as hell. The others laughed again, their voices harsh against the stillness of the night. One of them, a stocky officer with a mean streak visible in his scowl, rested a hand on the butt of his G*N, his posture shifting just enough to make the gesture noticeable. Tyson's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. You don't have anything on me. Let me pass. Griff's sneer deepened. He stepped closer, his baton tapping lightly against the palm of his other hand. What's the rush, big guy? We're just having a conversation here. No need to get all worked up. Tyson stood his ground, his calm demeanor seemingly unaffected by the officer's posturing. But there was a sharpness in his gaze now, a quiet warning that they either didn't see or didn't care to acknowledge. Snake, emboldened by Griff's lead, stepped forward, his expression twisted into something between a smirk and a snarl. Hey, tough guy, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. You got ID on you? We're gonna need to see some proof you belong around here. Tyson's gaze shifted to Snake, his expression unreadable. You don't have a reason to ask for that, he said, his voice low but firm. Snake laughed, the sound sharp and mean. Oh, we've got plenty of reasons. You're looking real out of place here, buddy. Might as well make it easy on yourself. Griff raised a hand, silencing Snake with a casual wave. No need to rush, he said, his tone mockingly soothing. He turned back to Tyson, his grin returning. We've got all night to sort this out. How about you start by handing over that ID? The semicircle tightened, the officers closing in just enough to make their presence inescapable. Griff twirled his baton again, his grin widening as he waited for a response. Tyson didn't move. His posture remained steady, his expression calm but unyielding. For a moment, the parking lot was silent, the only sound the faint hum of a distant car engine. Then, Griff took a step closer, his grin fading. Don't make this harder than it has to be, he said, his voice low, dangerous. We can do this the easy way, or... He let the sentence trail off, the unspoken threat hanging in the air like a challenge. The others chuckled softly, their hands inching closer to their weapons. Tyson's voice cut through the tension like a blade. I didn't do anything wrong, he said, his tone steady. And I'm not going to play your game. The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Griff's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the baton. The storm was here, and there was no walking away now. The air in the parking lot had shifted, taut as a wire stretched to its limit. The semicircle of officers loomed around Tyson, their postures rigid, their hands drifting closer to their batons and weapons. Griff's sneer deepened as he took another step forward, his baton tapping ominously against his palm. What's it gonna be, big guy? Griff taunted, his voice low and dripping with menace. Before Tyson could respond, Snake surged forward, his wiry frame lunging toward Tyson with a burst of aggression. The move was fast, but Tyson was faster. His instincts kicked in like a second nature honed through years of precision. Snake's hand shot out, aiming to grab Tyson's arm, but Tyson pivoted smoothly, deflecting the grab with a swift upward motion of his forearm. In the same breath, Tyson's fist connected with Snake's chest in a controlled but powerful strike. The officer stumbled backward, his balance faltering as he gasped for air. The other officers froze, their bravado momentarily replaced by shock. Snake crumpled to the ground, coughing and clutching his chest. "What the—" Griff started, but his words were drowned out as the rest of his men sprang into action. They rushed Tyson, their batons swinging and fists clenched, the thin veil of professionalism giving way to raw aggression. Tyson remained calm, his movements deliberate and precise. As the first officer charged, baton raised, Tyson sidestepped, delivering a sharp elbow strike to the man's ribs. The officer let out a pained grunt, dropping his baton as he staggered to the side. Another officer came at him from behind, aiming a wild swing toward his head. Tyson ducked, the baton cutting through empty air, and countered with a lightning-fast uppercut that sent the officer reeling backward. Each motion was fluid, each strike purposeful. Tyson's years of training were evident in every move, his body a weapon honed by discipline and experience. He moved like a predator among prey, his strikes efficient, his movements conserving energy even as he neutralized one threat after another. A third officer attempted a grab, his hands reaching for Tyson's shoulders. Tyson twisted sharply, breaking the grip and using the momentum to sweep the man's legs out from under him. The officer hit the ground with a thud, groaning as he clutched at his side. Griff's smug expression was gone now, replaced by disbelief and anger. His men lay sprawled around the parking lot, some groaning in pain, others too dazed to move. Snake was still on the ground, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. "You son of a—" Griff growled, yanking his taser from his belt. The device crackled as Griff leveled it at Tyson, his hand trembling with rage. But Tyson was already moving. He closed the distance between them in an instant, his hand shooting out to grab Griff's wrist. With a twist and a sharp downward motion, Tyson disarmed the taser and sent it skidding across the pavement. Griff barely had time to react before Tyson's leg swept under his, knocking him off balance. The officer hit the ground hard, the baton slipping from his grasp as he landed on his back. Before Griff could recover, Tyson knelt over him, one hand pressing down firmly on the man's chest to keep him pinned. Griff struggled, his face red with fury, but Tyson's strength kept him immobilized. "You have no right to treat people like this," Tyson said, his voice low but seething with controlled anger. Griff glared up at him, his defiance flickering but still present. "You're gonna regret this," he spat, though the words lacked the conviction they once held. Tyson leaned in closer, his gaze unyielding. "The only thing I regret is that you think you can get away with it." The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tense silence, their wails growing louder as they approached. Tyson stood, stepping back from Griff and glancing toward the diner. The faint outlines of faces pressed against the windows confirmed that they had an audience. The remaining officers, those who could still move, scrambled to their feet. Their postures were no longer threatening but frantic, the confidence they had wielded so easily now replaced by panic. A pair of patrol cars screeched into the lot, their lights flashing as the county sheriff and his deputies arrived. The sheriff, an older man with a stern expression and a commanding presence, stepped out first, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. "What the hell's going on here?" the sheriff barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. Griff struggled to his feet, his hand brushing dirt from his uniform. "Sheriff, this guy—" The sheriff held up a hand, silencing Griff mid-sentence. "I'll hear it from him," he said, his gaze shifting to Tyson. Tyson stood tall, his breathing steady despite the confrontation. "I was just trying to leave," he said simply. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he turned to the scattered officers. Griff's men avoided his gaze, their expressions a mix of shame and lingering pain. Snake leaned against the hood of a cruiser, still wheezing from Tyson's earlier blow. The sheriff sighed heavily, his disappointment evident. How many times do I have to tell you idiots to stop causing trouble in my county? He muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He turned back to Tyson, his tone softening. You all right? Tyson nodded. I'm fine. The sheriff gave him a curt nod before addressing his deputies. Get these men out of here, he ordered, gesturing to Griff and his crew. We'll deal with this back at the station. Griff opened his mouth to protest, but the sheriff's glare silenced him. One by one, the officers were led away, their once dominant presence reduced to a walk of shame. As they disappeared into the patrol cars, the onlookers in the diner erupted into applause. The sound was loud, filled with approval and relief. Tyson didn't linger. He walked to his SUV, the tension in his body easing as he climbed inside. The sheriff watched him go, his expression thoughtful. You're welcome in this town anytime, he called out as Tyson started the engine. Tyson gave him a small nod, then pulled out of the lot, leaving the chaos behind. As he drove into the night, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road replaced the echoes of the encounter. He hadn't sought the fight, but sometimes standing firm was the only way to remind the world of its limits.